Now that we've done our initial introduction to juvenile delinquency, we're going to consider how it's measured and what kinds of general trends these measurements show us. There are three kinds of measurements that are used most often to understand juvenile delinquency. These are the uniform crime reports, self-reporting studies, and the national crime victimization studies. We'll talk about each one and what they collect and the value of each set of studies.
I'm going to tell you up front that the Uniform Crime Reports tends to create a data set that does not collect all the information that one would want to be fully accurate, because many kinds of crimes tend to be underreported. Crimes that are more private in nature, such as domestic violence or crimes regarding sex, these tend to take place in the privacy of the home, and their reporting incidence is much lower than, say, a public type of crime. Certain crimes tend to be highly reported. That would be crimes like auto theft, because it's pretty obvious if your car is stolen, and it had to be reported to collect insurance, and because almost all cars are registered and used in public places. So then the hope is that they can be found and recovered. So that kind of crime reporting is very accurate in relation to the number of incidents that take place. Self-reporting studies, when done properly, also meaning that they assure confidentiality, and also the National Crime Victimization Studies, are believed to be much higher than the UCR regarding accuracy. But just so you know, the NCVS tends to be used more for assessing trends in adult crime. One shortfall of the NCVS for juvenile studies is that the person reporting the crime doesn't always know the age of their perpetrator. Now I'll talk a little bit over the next couple of slides about each of these types of studies. The Uniform Crime Reports are collected by the FBI. Every law enforcement agency, whether it's the local city police, the county sheriff, or the state police, is required to send statistics regarding arrest for certain offenses to the FBI. They are only required to send what are known as the Part 1 offenses, which include the more serious felony offenses: murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary and larceny, auto theft, and arson. For the purpose of understanding how this is relevant to juveniles, these are actually the offenses that would be seen in adult court. Very rarely, if ever, are minor offenses transferred to adult court. These figures are collected when they are cleared by arrest, meaning, of course, that someone has been arrested for the offense. If no one is arrested, the report of the offense is not counted as part of the statistical set. So as I said earlier, there are some flaws in collecting data in this manner. While some crimes are fairly accurate in their reporting, such as the high visibility crimes like murder or auto theft, others are not so often reported. The more private the crime, the less accurate the statistics are on it. We know, for instance, that incidents of domestic violence are much higher than the amount that's reported. And even when something is reported, the perpetrator is not always arrested. Think in terms of domestic violence, where the police are called, but the couple is referred instead for counseling rather than an arrest being made. Self-reports yield better data sets that are much more accurate than the UCR. These reports go far beyond the Part 1 offenses that the UCR considers. Remember, the UCR just collects data on the most serious offenses. Self-reports, instead, consider a wide variety of behaviors. When self-reporting is done properly, i.e. assuring confidentiality, and the subjects are treated appropriately, then the accuracy of the data is much higher than the UCR. It's believed that the data from well-constructed self-reports is much more valid and reliable than any other method that's used for collecting information about juvenile delinquency. One data set was developed by a researcher named Del Elliott, and he started collecting data in the 1970s. This is called the National Youth Survey. With its long span of information, what's known as a longitudinal study in sociology, this is over a long period of time, we can see that there are some trends regarding changes of the rates of offenses. What self-reporting studies indicate is that law enforcement is not aware of many of the delinquent acts that are occurring. It tells us also that lower class youth are not the only ones that are committing offenses, that middle class youth are just as likely to be offenders, but their offenses are being dealt with differently. We also know that many of the serious offenders are not being apprehended by law enforcement. And we can analyze the data according to race. And when we do that, we begin to realize that black youth, even though their crime rates are the same as their white counterparts, that these black youth are more likely to be arrested, convicted, and institutionalized, meaning taken out of the home and put into a residential treatment program. This phenomenon of black youth being removed from the home is what is called in the justice system disproportionate minority confinement. It's prevalent not only in the juvenile justice system, but also in the adult system. It's a very strong concern in the Department of Justice, the federal agency that oversees the correction systems in the U.S. And the last category of data is what's known as victimization surveys. This data is collected by the Bureau of Justice, which is a federal agency. They actually partner with the Census Bureau in gathering this data. The Census Bureau, who has well-trained workers that are responsible for gathering data not only about the population in general, and when you have a moment, you might want to check out the U.S. Census website. There's some very interesting information there. So what do census workers do during the 9 years when they are not collecting the data for the U.S. Census that's held every 10 years? They gather all sorts of other data, including partnering with other federal agencies like the Bureau of Justice. The idea here is that the NCVS gets to the data using a different methodology than the UCR, and that's used to check the accuracy of the UCR. The National Victimization Survey is a sampling of a large number of households. I was actually selected by a census worker about 30 years ago to be a respondent and went through the entire process, which from the standpoint of being a subject was very interesting for me. Confidentiality was very important to assure the collection of the data. During our interview, we had to be in a room with the doors closed and the assurance that no one would overhear our conversations, so that I wouldn't feel pressured by anyone to not fully disclose all information related to being a victim. So what does the National Victimization Survey tell us about juvenile offenders? We know that youth ages 16 to 19 are more likely to be victims, and that adolescents are most likely to be the assailant when the victim knows the perpetrator. And we also know that crimes against youth are less likely to be reported to the police. Let's talk about a couple other trends in juvenile delinquency. We know that there are many more males that come into the juvenile justice system than there are females, and that the ratio is over 2 to 1 males to female. Depending on the kind of crime, it may be even higher. For example, the ratio is about 3 to 1 boys to girls for property crime. And for drugs and violent crimes, the ratio is about 5 to 1 boys to girls. For violent crime, it's even higher, about 5.8 boys to every 1 girl. And there's another trend that I mentioned earlier, and that's DMC. DMC refers to the fact that blacks are historically overrepresented in the juvenile justice system. This is true in adult corrections as well, that blacks are overrepresented at over double what they are in the actual population. This issue is considered critical enough that it's what is known as a core requirement mandate by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, another federal agency. What I mean by this is that all states are required to consider DMC in the juvenile justice system and to study the issue and attempt to resolve it. This is a federal mandate that's been in place since Janet Reno was the Attorney General under President Clinton in the early 1990s. So in order for states to receive federal funds from OJJDP, they've got to make efforts to study and resolve DMC. When the states get their pool of money from the federal government, they have a certain amount that's set aside for the DMC effort. The problem is that the issue is very systemic, and it's not something where programs directly affect the outcomes. It's not a difficult issue to study, but it's a very difficult issue to solve. DMC is a systemic issue that now is thought of to be due to implicit bias at many different points in the justice system. And that, of course, is why I often assign the implicit association test as an assignment for this course. So the juvenile justice system is thought of as a funnel, with youth entering the system at the top or the widest point of the funnel, and as they go through the system they drop out of the funnel. The points at which they drop out are the different decision-making processes at the beginning or the top of the funnel. And at the beginning or the top of the funnel are all the cases that are reported. Then below that are those that law enforcement decide to arrest. And then below that, what cases might get diverted, meaning no petition to court. Then what is plea bargained out. Then finally, what goes to trial, some found guilty, some innocent. And then at the very, very bottom, there are those that are probated, sent home under community supervision in terms of probation, versus those that actually do go into prison, or in the case of juveniles, are sent to residential treatment. So for all the cases where the police receive a complaint or investigate the case, a very, very small proportion of those people wind up getting locked up. What we know is that minority youth and youth with lower socioeconomic status are much more likely to be locked up than those that have different master statuses. We know from the self-reporting studies, which I've already told you have greater accuracy regarding who commits what kinds of crime, we know that these reports show that black youth are only slightly more likely than white youth to actually commit an offense. And in fact, the self-reporting studies also show that drug use amongst white youth is higher, but that black youth are more likely to be removed from their homes for drug use. There are differences in rates of youth in the juvenile justice system based on socioeconomic status as well. The rates are quite different between the lower and higher socioeconomic brackets. It's difficult to tell why these differences in rates exist. As you can see from the slide, the rate of those that are in the lower socioeconomic status groups are much more likely to be in the juvenile justice system. Who becomes a serious offender? We know that there are certain predictive factors in who will become the serious offender committing a higher level of felony offense, or who becomes the long-term career offender. OJJDP is highly invested in understanding these trends so that they can focus their efforts and resources on interventions with these groups. We know that when a youth starts missing school, particularly when they become truant, meaning they're missing school without a legitimate absence, that they're much more likely to become a serious career offender. But we are also aware that the schools file petitions on youth, and that taking a student out of school then reduces the likelihood of petitions being filed against that youth, and thus reduces the incidence of delinquency. Researchers and policy analysts are not just interested in who and why people are committing offenses, but also as to why they stop committing offenses. In studying trends, it's important to recognize that there are trends regarding desistance from crime. There are several different theories about that, including the concept of the maturation effect, that youth mature into adulthood, and the likelihood that continued offending is due to that maturation. That youth start to make more rational choices as they go into adulthood, that developmental changes occur, and that social learning theories and life course theories are at play.
Now that we've talked about some overall general trends in juvenile justice, next we're going to be looking at some slides that consider specific data, which is from the assigned supplemental materials on juvenile court statistics.